You have to have a meaning in life that sustains you. Life is a serious business. You're all in. It's a fatal business, right? Everyone's in it up to their neck. And you need a meaning that can sustain you through that. And that's to be found in responsibility. We all know this, that it's better to live courageously than cowardly. Everyone knows that. That's what you teach people that you love. You wake up in the morning, your consciousness reemerges on the stage of existence. And what you're confronted by is the potential of the day. You see the day as a set of possible pathways. You could do this, you could do that, you could not do this, you could not do that. And your conscience speaks to you too, almost immediately, I would say, upon awakening. Here's something I need to do today to keep things in order. Here's something I need not to do today to keep things in order. Here's my set of obligations that I need to undertake so that when I go to sleep tonight, I can sleep with a clear conscience and things are better than they might have otherwise been. And so what you see in front of you is the potential of the world. And to me, you see, that's akin to the potential that God confronted in Genesis at the beginning of time. That's the meaning of that story, is that there's a potential that is confronted by an attitude. And the attitude that is appropriate in relationship to that confrontation is the attitude of the Logos. And the Logos is something like courage. That's one of its primary attributes, and truth. That's the other. Now there's more, but I would say if you had to boil it down to two, it would be courage and truth. And the idea there is that if you confront the potential that's in front of you with truth and courage, that what you do is you take what could be and you transform it into what is. And you do that and you transform it into what is that's good. And you have that is you. That's your soul. That's the thing that, as Genesis points out, that gives you that affinity with God. The fact that you're made in the image of God is the fact that you have that capability, and that capability to take that potential and to make the world out of it is also dependent on your ethical choices. And everyone knows that, right? Even if we can't articulate it, you know perfectly well that you can wake up in a miserable mood, bitter and unhappy, and do 25 things that day to make your life more like hell than it was, and to share that delight with the people around you. Everyone understands that. And you know as well that you can decide to face things courageously and truthfully, and you can make tomorrow's morning somewhat better than today's morning was by setting the world in order. You can't be doing that because you want to be a good person in some sense. And you can't be doing that because you want to be seen as being a good person. That's not the right attitude. You have to be doing it because it's the transcendently right thing to do. It's the thing that you do if you aim at the highest possible ideal. And that is laid out in the Sermon on the Mount, is that you should aim at the highest possible ideal, and then that you should concentrate on the day. And it's deadly serious psychological advice. Aim high. Lift your eyes above the horizon, right? Lift your eyes to the stars that beckon above. Try to set things right and to orient your life. And there has to be a relationship with the transcendent that allows you to do that properly, or it becomes an exercise in ego, and then it doesn't work. You have to have a meaning in life that sustains you. Life is a serious business. You're all in. It's a fatal business, right? Everyone's in it up to their neck. And it's dreadful in some sense. And you need a meaning that can sustain you through that. And that's to be found in responsibility. And that's something that we have not communicated, I don't think, well to ourselves, but we certainly haven't communicated it to young people. It's like, well, you're lost. There's reasons that you could be lost, and they're real. God only knows what terrible things happen to you in your life. It's like, how are you going to get out of that? Well, not by pursuing impulsive happiness. That is not going to work. Not by thinking in the short term. Not by thinking in a narrowly selfish manner either. But by taking on the heaviest load of responsibility that you can conceptualize and bear. That will do it. It'll do it for you. It'll give you a reason to wake up in the morning. It'll give you a balm for your conscience when you wake up at night and ask yourself what you're doing with your life. It'll make you a credit to yourself and to your family, and it'll make you a boon to your community. And more than that, there's more than that. It's said in Genesis that every person is made in the image of God. And there's an idea in Genesis that God is that which confronts the chaos of potential with truth and courage. That's the logos. And if we're made in the image of God, that's us. That's what we do, is we confront the potential of chaos, the future, the unformed future. We confront that consciously. And we decide with every ethical choice we make what kind of world we're going to bring into being. We transform that potential into actuality. And we do that as a consequence of our ethical decisions. And so it's not only a matter of putting yourself together and putting your family together, and putting your community together. It's a matter of bringing the world in its proper shape into being. And I truly believe that that's the case. And I believe that we all believe that. Like, we hold ourselves responsible. You know that if you've made a mistake with your family, because you were selfish or narrow-minded or blind in some manner, that you regard yourself as culpable. You could have done otherwise. And now you've brought something into the world that should not be there. And it's on you. We hold ourselves responsible in that manner. And so what that indicates to me is that in a deep sense we believe that we are the agents that transform the potential of being into reality. And that is a divine, if anything, links us with divinity. It's our capability to transform what is not yet into what is. And the other thing that happens, and I'll stop with this in Genesis, and this is so interesting, it's so fascinating, is that as God conducts himself through this enterprise of the transformation of potential into actuality, he stops repeatedly and says, and it was good. And that's a mystery. Why is it good? And the answer is something like, well, if you conduct yourself with the courage that enables you to accept your vulnerability, which is no trivial matter, and if you're truthful, then what you bring out of potential is what's good. And that sets the world right. And that's up to us. And to me, that's the great story of the West. That's why we regard ourselves as sovereign individuals of value. That's what we are. And we need to know that, to take ourselves seriously and to act properly in the world.
You're actually strong enough to do that. You just don't know it. And you won't find out till you do it. You can't find out till you do it. But if you did it, you'd find out that it was true. It's a massive risk. It's the ultimate in risks, right? You have to be willing to lose your life in order to find it. It's like, exactly right. I mean, Buddha finds his enlightenment under a tree. It's not fluke that that's the case. That's his natural environment. And he's sitting in the lotus here. The lotus opens up. It's this thing that springs up from the depths. And he sits there illuminated the same way. He's got a halo that's the sun that stands for higher consciousness. And he's transcended by accepting the fact that life is suffering. He's transcended the limitations that are part of mortality. This is the thing that this idea is what enables people to transcend their suffering. And Buddha said, well, don't be too attached to things. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean deny the world. It might mean deny the world if you're too in love with the material, like with material well-being, let's say, then your pathway to transcendence and meaning might be to abandon that because it's constraining you. It's making you less than you could be. But the fundamental lesson, the more fundamental lesson that's underneath that is don't let what you are stop you from being what you could be. Right. And so then the question is, well, what do you identify with? Do you identify with what you are? Then you're a tyrant. Do you identify with chaos? Because that's the opposite of order, say. Then you're nihilistic. Well, you don't identify with either of those. You know that they're both necessary. You know that you have to live with both of them, but you identify with the capacity to continually transcend what you are. And then you seek out error. That's what humility is. It's like, I'm error-ridden. It's like, so I want to put myself in a situation where I can discover one of my errors, hopefully not in a way that's going to knock me completely out of the game, right? I want to seek out a challenge. I want to find out where my limits are. I want to find out where there's not enough of me yet. And I want to do that in a way that's engaging, because, you know, you can wear yourself out fighting dragons, obviously. You can exhaust yourself completely, and that's not helpful. You know, one of the things I learned, for example, when I was coaching lawyers, these were people who had very high-end careers, and so they had an infinite workload. No matter how much they worked, flat out, there was always way more work that they should do. It's a very difficult thing to learn to manage. And so they were exhausting themselves, and I said, well, you know, you have to work less per day. It's like, well, no, that's not happening. I can't do that. And so what I learned over time was, okay, so this is what you have to do. Every 3 months, you have to block off 4 days and go have a vacation. And you have to plan that in advance so it's in your calendar so that your secretary doesn't book your time. And then you need that because you have to recuperate enough so that you can work as hard as you're going to work. And of course, they were nervous about that. And I said, well, look, we can calibrate this. Let's keep track of your billable hours over the next year and see if they increase or decrease. Because I bet you if you take more time off, you'll actually have more billable hours. You'll actually have your cake and eat it too. You'll get to have a vacation and you'll be more productive. And that inevitably, that was what happened. And so that's a matter of calibrating the game properly, right? You want to play a game that you can play today, but also one that you can play next week and next month. We're not talking about, you know, your career this week. We're talking about you having a career that lasts 30 years, that doesn't kill you, that doesn't make you hate yourself or the job, that doesn't make you bitter, that doesn't wear you to a frazzle. So it has to be optimized. And so I think that you can, in fact, decide to take on the load that's optimally meaningful if you want, and then you get to have your cake and eat it too. You're on the pathway to continual incremental improvement. You only have to burn off a feather at a time instead of having the whole bloody thing burst into flames. But it's a constant source of renewal. And there's an idea that to be renewed, you have to drink the water of life, right? That's an old mythological idea. And what's the water? The water of life. Chaos is water. Water is chaos. Water is what washes away too much order. And to stay continually, let's say, refreshed by the water of life is to take on exactly the right amount of chaos to make sure that your garden is properly nourished. And I think meaning is actually the marker of that. I'll tell you what it is that you need to do to be successful. Some of these things aren't so malleable, but others are things that you can work on. Well, IQ, well, that's a rough one, because there's no evidence, as far as I can tell, that you can do a damn thing about your IQ. I've reviewed that literature like 6 times in the last 15 years because I keep hoping that someone will crack the problem, but it's always the same answer. It's like, you do brain training games, you get better at the game, a lot better at that game. You get slightly better at similar games, but distal games that are still heavily cognitively loaded doesn't affect your performance at all. Zero, none. So the issue of how to raise IQ, man, that's a killer. No one knows how to do it. I can tell you how to stop your IQ from decreasing as you get older. That's not so bad because it does that. Fluid IQ decreases from the time you're 20 and pretty rapidly. It's physical health is the best preventative. So exercise, physical exercise. Weirdly enough, you know, you think, well, why? Well, your brain uses oxygen like mad, right? And it needs to be kept clean and well oxygenated. And physical exercise, both like weightlifting, so anaerobic and aerobic exercise, both seem to be very, very effective at staving off cognitive declines across the lifespan. So that's a really useful thing to know, because that's the only thing we know that does that. So then the next best predictor of lifetime success is conscientiousness. And of the 2 aspects of conscientiousness, say orderliness and industriousness, the better predictor is industriousness. So the question is, well, what can you do about your industriousness? And the answer to that is, well, that's kind of rough too, because there's a strong genetic component. But you can work on micro habits with regards to your conscientiousness. And I think the best thing you can do with regards to your conscientiousness is to set up some aims for yourself, goals that you actually value. And so the questions are something like, well, all right, you're going to have to put some effort into your life, and you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the big five manner. You know, if you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high in neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own personality. But then there are dimensions that you want to consider your life across. And so we ask people about, well, you know, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use? Because that's a good place to auger down, because alcoholism, for example, wipes out 5 to 10% of people. So you want to keep that under control. And then maybe you develop a vision of what you would like your life to be. Then you break down the goal into micro processes that you can implement. The micro processes become rewarding in relation to their causal association with the goal. And that tangles in your incentive reward system, the dopaminergic incentive reward system. And that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day. You're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from, so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. And then the next question might be, well, where should you look for worthwhile things? And one would be, well, you could consult your own temperament. And the other would be, well, you kind of look at what it is that people accrue that's valuable across the lifespan. So you do a structural analysis of the subcomponents of human existence, and already did that. You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. That's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. But once you set up that goal structure, let's say, and that's really, in many ways, that's what you should be doing at university. That's exactly what you should be doing, is trying to figure out who it is that you're trying to be, right? You aim at that. And then you use everything you learned as a means of building that person that you want to be. And I really mean want to be. I don't mean should be, even those things are going to overlap. And it's important to distinguish between those, and this is back down to the micro routine analysis. So if I was saying, well, you're going to try to make yourself more industrious, okay, number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. So I would recommend that you don't let that happen. So that's willful blindness, right? You could have known, but you chose not to. Okay, so once you get your goal structure set up, you think, okay, if I could have this life, looks like that might be worth living, despite the fact that it's going to be, anxiety provoking and threatening, and there's going to be some suffering and loss involved and all of that. Obviously, the goal is to have a vision for your life such that, all things considered, that justifies your effort. So then what do? Then you turn down to the micro routines. It's like, okay, well, this is what I'm aiming for. How does that instantiate itself day to day, week to week, month to month? And that's where something like a schedule can be unbelievably useful. It's like, make a damn schedule and stick to it. Okay, so what's the rule with the schedule? It's not a bloody prison. That's the first thing that people do wrong. They say, well, I don't like to follow a schedule. Well, what kind of schedule are you setting up? Well, I have to do this, then I have to do this, then I have to do this, and then I just go play video games, because who wants to do all these things that I have to do? It's like, wrong. Set the damn schedule up so that you have the day you want. That's the trick. It's like, okay, I've got tomorrow. If I was going to set it up so it was the best possible day I could have, practically speaking, what would it look like? Well, then you schedule that. And obviously there's a bit of responsibility that's going to go along with that, because if you have any sense, one of the things that you're going to insist upon is that at the end of the day, you're not in worse shape than you were at the beginning of the day, right? Because that's a stupid day. If you have a bunch of those in a row, you dig yourself a hole and then you bury yourself in it. It's like, sorry, that's just not a good strategy. It's a bad strategy. So maybe 20% of your day has to be responsibility and obligation, or maybe it's more than that, depending on how far behind you are. But even that, you can ask yourself, okay, well, I've got these responsibilities. I have to schedule the damn things in. What's the right ratio of responsibility to reward? And you can ask yourself that, just like you'd negotiate with someone who is working for you. It's like, okay, you got to work tomorrow. Okay, so I want you to work tomorrow. And you might say, okay, well, what are you going to do for me that makes it likely that I'll work for you? Well, you could ask yourself that, Maybe you do an hour of responsibility and then you play a video game for 15 minutes. I don't know, whatever turns your crank, man. But you have to negotiate with yourself and not tyrannize yourself. Like you're negotiating with someone that you care for, that you would like to be productive and have a good life. And that's how you make the schedule. And then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. Great. And you're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0, right? And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, or because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. So that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss. And both of those work, for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. You should fire yourself and find someone else to be. But my point is that you have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with, and you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people because they don't like themselves very much. So, they're always like cracking the whip and then procrastinating, and cracking the whip and then procrastinating. And it's like, God, it's so boring and such a pathetic way of spending your time. And you know what that's like, because you probably waste like 6 hours a day. And I think we did an economic calculation about that a while back, right? Your time's probably worth $50 an hour, something like that. I mean, you're not getting paid that now, but you're young. And so this is investment time. And what you do now is going to multiply its effects in the future. So let's say it's $50 an hour, which is perfectly reasonable. So if you waste 6 hours a day, and you are, then you're wasting about $2,000 a week, or about $100,000 a year. So go ahead, but that's what it's costing you every hour. And you need to know what your damn time is worth. So let's say it's not $50, it's 30, whatever. Maybe it's 100, it's somewhere in that range. One of the things you should be asking yourself is, when you spend an hour, was that, well, would have I paid someone $50 to have had that hour? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, maybe you should do something else with your time. And it depends on whether or not you think that your time's worthwhile. But the funny thing about not assuming that is if you assume your time isn't worthwhile, what happens is you don't just sit around sort of randomly in a state of responsibility-less bliss. What you do is you suffer existentially. And so that seems like a stupid solution. Information that's being provided to you from your body, sort of bottom up, to determine when you were being inauthentic or non-congruent. And I've thought about this for a long time and tried to sort it out in a practical manner, and what I've concluded is this. You could try this for a couple of weeks. It's an extremely interesting exercise. So you sort of have to detach yourself from your thoughts and what you say. So you got to assume, you start by assuming that what you say and what you think is not necessarily you. And of course that's just the case, because a lot of what you think, in fact most of what you think and most of what you say, are the opinions of other people. They're things you've read or things people have told you, and you know that's a benefit in some ways because you get all those thoughts that other people have spent a long time formulating, but it's a disadvantage in that it's not exactly you. Okay, so you detach yourself from that. You're no longer your thoughts or the things that you say, or maybe you're no longer all of them. And now what you're going to try to find out is which of your thoughts and things that you say are you, and maybe so you can not utilize the rest, or maybe so that you can correct the rest, because they're not representative of yourself as an integrated being. They don't take everything into account. My sense has been that you can tell when you're saying something that's not authentic by feeling out whether or not it makes you weak or strong. Now, you know, sometimes when you're conversing with people, you can say something that embarrasses yourself. Now, Nietzsche said, for example, everyone has perjured themselves at least once in the attempt to maintain their good name. Something like that. It's not an exact quote, but I've got the gist of it right. So maybe you're saying things to impress someone, or you're saying things to remain part of your political group or your social group or whatever, or maybe you have attributes, personal attributes that might be positive that you're ashamed of, and so you're not going to speak about them. So there's a falseness about your self-representation. Watch for 2 weeks and see. Make a rule that if you start to say something and it makes you feel weak, what it means is that I can feel things coming apart sort of in my midsection, so I think it's an autonomic phenomena, and the subjective sense is of falsehood. It's like I've just stepped off the solid ground and onto something that doesn't support me well, and it feels like a self-betrayal. So that's existential inauthenticity. You can feel it right away. And then the rule is, shut up if that happens. Stop talking. And then feel around and see if you can find some words that you can say in that situation that don't produce that sensation. You see this played out in different forms of drama. So it's not all that obvious why a cliche is a bad thing, but a cliche is a bad thing in the same way that being possessed by the dead is a bad thing. It's like a cliche isn't you. It's something else. It's like the crowd. It's like the other. It's not living. It has nothing to do with you. And part of the reason that students use cliches is because it's easier than using your own genuine creative formulation. So you can just default to cliche use, but there's something more insidious than that, is that if you write an essay that's nothing but a string of cliches and you get criticized, then you're not being criticized. What's being criticized is the cliches, and you can hide behind that, and the part of you that's wise but treacherous thinks, well, the criticism doesn't really apply to me because, you know, I didn't really say what I thought. And then there's this kind of sense you get that you've gotten away with something, which is a terrible thing. So when I read undergraduate essays, what I see very frequently is, especially the first essay, it's just nothing but cliches. It's awful. It's dull. You can hardly stand reading it because there's nothing in it that's gripping or alive. And then maybe the second essay, you can see there's a layer of cliche, and then now and then the person will be brave enough to poke up a thought of their own. It'll just sort of poke up somewhere maybe in 3 pages in. It's like this little green shoot that's barely alive, and the person is brave enough to pop it up in the hope that, you know, maybe it won't get walloped down with a sledgehammer. And so one of the things I try to do is to point that out. It's like, look, you know, this is something, there's a real thought here. It's a real original thought. It's something that you have the right to, because it's derived from your own experience and your own knowledge, and you've formulated it in an original and compelling way. But the problem with that is that if you get criticized for that, you're just going to pull right back into your shell, right? Because that hurts, because it's actually part of you that you've exposed. And that's a terrifying thing, to expose yourself like that. But it's an absolute prerequisite to genuine communication and thought. But the ancient Mesopotamians had figured out 5,000 years ago or so that the highest God in the hierarchy of gods, so sort of like the highest value, or the thing that should be imitated most carefully, was a God whose head had eyes all the way around it, and who spoke magic words. And so the words he spoke could make the sun rise and make the sun set. Very, very powerful speaker. And the reason the Mesopotamians had figured this out to the degree they had was because they realized that the capacity to pay attention, which is the eyes, of course, because we really pay attention with our eyes, and then the capacity to speak properly is in fact the highest virtue. And so then you can check yourself, you can see, all you have to do is listen, like you would listen to someone else. And you have to feel, you think, do I actually believe that? Is that actually my thought? And really, I'll tell you, what you'll find is 95% of what you say has nothing to do with you. So it's quite shocking to do this, because you'll start to say something and you'll think, oh, that doesn't feel quite right. Like, it doesn't make me feel solid when I say it. There's something about that I'm subordinating myself to something or hiding in some way. It's very difficult to figure out exactly what you're doing. But you'll find out that almost everything that's abstractly represented. So in some sense, you know way more than you can actually know.
The reason that I think people believe what I say is that I'm very pessimistic. Most times when you listen to someone who's a motivational speaker, let's say, it fills you with a temporary optimism, but you go home and the wiser part of you knows that mostly it's the painting over of rotten wood with a fresh coat of paint. And I tell my audiences very clearly that their life is going to be difficult, and sometimes difficult beyond both imagining and tolerance. And that is definitely in your future, if it isn't in your present. And for many people, it's in their present. And that can be unbearable, that enough to turn you against life itself, to corrupt you, to drive you to nihilism, to drive you to suicide, and worse, to drive you to thoughts of vengefulness, of infinite scope, to not only be turned against yourself and your fellow men, but to be turned against being itself because of its intrinsically brutal, in some sense, nature. And then it's worse than that, actually, because it's not only that we suffer and that will necessarily occur, but that we all make our suffering worse because of our ignorance and our malevolence. And everyone knows that to be true. And so the discussions start, let's say, on an unshakable foundation. But then I can tell people, look, despite that, we're remarkable creatures. You know, we're capable of taking up the burden of that suffering and facing the reality of that malevolence voluntarily. We can actually do that. And all of the psychological evidence suggests, and this is independent of your school of psychology, if you're a practical psychologist, a clinical psychologist of any sort, the evidence is crystal clear that if people voluntarily confront the problems that face them and the malevolence that surrounds them, that they can make headway against it. And not only psychologically. So it's not only meaningful to do that psychologically, which it is, to confront the problems that torment you voluntarily. That's meaningful psychologically. But it's also practically useful in that you can actually solve some of the problems that beset you. And God only knows how good we could get at that. You know, I mean, I don't know what percentage of human effort is spent in counterproductive activity. You know, I'm not an absolute cynic about that, but I mean, when I talk to undergraduates, I ask them, you know, how much time do you waste every day by your own reckoning? And it's somewhere between 5 and 8 hours. I walked the students through an economic analysis of that. I said, well, why don't you value your time at $50 an hour and calculate for yourself just exactly what you're doing to your future by your inability to discipline yourself. It's worth thinking through. In any case, people do waste a lot of time, and they also act counterproductively a lot of the time. Regardless, we do make progress, and we can thrive under the difficult conditions that make up our lives, and we can resist the malevolence that entices us. That's within our power, and we don't know the limits to that. And we also know that it's better to, we all know this, that it's better to live courageously than cowardly. Everyone knows that. That's what you teach people that you love. And we know that it's better to live truthfully than in deceit. And you can tell that too, because that's also what you tell people that you love. And we know that you should pick up your damn responsibility and move forward. Everyone knows that. It's part of our intrinsic moral nature. And that nature is there. And it's not difficult to communicate to people about this. Like, everyone knows that you wake up at 3 a.m. when you've let your life go off the rails, and that you berate yourself for your uselessness and your cruelty and your failure to take the opportunities that are in front of you. And if you were the master in your own house, in some sense, the captain of your own destiny, if there was no intrinsic nature, well, that would never happen. You'd just let yourself off the hook. There'd be no voice of conscience tormenting you. But no one escapes from that. And what that indicates, to me, is that, at least psychologically, we live in a universe that's characterized by a moral dimension, and we understand that well, and that moral failings have consequences, and that they're not trivial. They destroy you. They destroy your family. They destroy your community. And you can tell people that, and they listen because they know. They don't know they know. That's the thing, and maybe that's the thing about being an intellectual. You have the opportunity to articulate ideas that other people know, they embody, but they can't articulate. And that's what people tell me. They say, well, you help me give words to things that I always knew to be true but couldn't say. Or they say, I've been trying to put some of your precepts into practice. Responsibility being a main one, vision another, honesty, I suppose, bringing up the pack and saying, and this is the fun part of doing all of this. Fun is a weak word. That it's the remarkable part of doing all this. I mean, I have people tell me constantly wherever I go, it's so delightful that, they were in a pretty dark place, and they tell me why. And there's plenty of dark places in the world, and they decided, well, maybe they were going to develop a bit of a vision and take a bit more responsibility and start telling the truth and putting some effort into something. And they come up and they say, well, you can't believe how much better things are. It's like, I got 3 promotions. I had one guy tell me, this was a lovely story, 15 seconds. He came up after a talk. He said, 2 years ago, I got out of jail. I was homeless. He said, I own my own house. I have a 6-figure income. I got married and I have a daughter. Thank you. And that was the whole conversation. It's like he decided he was going to put his life together. And and so you can look at that pessimism that constitutes, let's say, the core of what, well, I think it's the core religious message, really, is the tragic nature of the world, the reality of suffering. It's part of the core religious message. But what emerges out of that, properly conceptualized, is a remarkable appreciation for what human beings are capable of. Like, we are unbelievably resilient and able creatures, and we do not have any conception of our upper limits. I would say for the last 45 years, we've told, psychologists have been certainly to blame for this, at least in part. you're okay the way you are. That's what we tell young people. Oh, you're okay the way you are. It's like, and there's nothing worse than you can tell someone who's young than that, especially if they're miserable. Oh, I'm miserable and aimless, and sometimes I'm suicidal and I'm nihilistic and I don't have any direction in your life. In my life. It's like, well, you're okay the way you are. They don't want to hear that. They want to hear, look, and you know this, you're useless. You haven't got started. You've got 60 years to put yourself together, and God only knows what you could become. And that message is so much more, it's so funny because it's such an attack, but it's so positive because there's faith there in the potential that makes up the person rather than the miserable actuality that happens to be manifesting itself at the moment. And young people respond extraordinarily well to that because, and you know that if you're a parent and you love your child, your son, your daughter, what you're trying to foster is the best in them. You want that to manifest itself across the course of their life. You want them to become continually more than they are, to see what they could be. And I think that's part of the great message of the West, is that's the ethical requirement of individual being in the proper sense, is to constantly note that you're not what you could be, to take responsibility for that, and to commit yourself, like body and soul, to the attainment of that ideal.
If you concentrate solely on your career, you can get a long way in your career. And I would say that that's a strategy that a minority of men preferentially do. That's all they do. They work like 70, 80 hours a week. They go flat out on their career. They're staking everything on the small probability of exceptional status in a narrow domain. But it's hard on them. They don't have a life. It's very difficult for them to have a family. They don't know how to take any leisure activity. Like, they get very one-dimensional. Now, it may be that unidimensionality is the price you have to pay to be exceptional at one thing, right? Because if you're going to be something like a genius level mathematician and you want to do that or a scientist, say, it's like you're in your lab all the time, you're working 70 hours a week or 80 hours a week, you're smart, you're dedicated, you're unidimensional, and that's how you get to beat all the other people who are doing that. It's the only way. But the problem is you don't get a life. Now, if you love being a scientist and you have that kind of focus of mind, well, first of all, you're a rare person, and second, you're going to pay for it. But fine, more power to you. But it's a risky business to do that. You sacrifice a lot for it. And I would say most often, if you're speaking about having a healthy life, that isn't what you do. You spread yourself out more. So, you have a family, you have some things that you do outside of work that are meaningful to you and useful. You have a network of friends. Those four things alone are plenty to keep you well oriented. And then if one of those things collapses, everything doesn't go. Now, the price you pay for that is the more you strive to optimize that balance, the less likely you are to be fantastically successful at any single one of them. But you might have a very, if you consider your life as a whole, that might be a winning strategy. One of the things Carl Jung said, I really liked this. He thought that men went after perfection and women went after wholeness. There's something different at the top of the value hierarchy. So perfection would be stake it all on one thing and look for radical success. Not that all men do that, because they don't, but we're talking about extremes, at least with regards to the men that do that. The wholeness idea is more like, I want one thing in my life to be 150%, or I want 5 things in my life to be 80%. There's a lot more richness in a life where you have 5 things operating at 80%, but you're not operating at any of them at 150%. So, and I really believe this because I've watched men and women go through their careers now for a long period of time. And one of the things there's lots of things that produce this, but one of the things that I've noticed is that mostly women in their 30s bail out of unidimensional careers. They won't do them. They won't put in the 80 hours a week that they would have to put in order to dominate that particular area. And it isn't, the reason that they won't do it is because they decide it's not worth it. And no wonder, because Why would that be worth it? You have to ask yourself that. It's like, well, you want to be an outstanding scientist. It's like, okay, really, that's what you want? Because that means that's what you do. Because you're competing with other people. You know, they're smart, they're hardworking, and if you want to be at the top, you have to be smarter and work harder than any of them. And working hard means working long hours. I mean, it also means working diligently, but in the final analysis, it's also an additive issue. If I'm smart and hardworking and I can crank out for 70 hours a week, and you do it for 30, it's like, in 2 years, I'm so far ahead of you, you will never, ever catch up. And I think maybe part of the reason too that women are oriented that way more than men, I think there's two reasons. One is socioeconomic status does not make women more attractive on the mating market, but it does make men more attractive. And the second is women's time frame is compressed, right? Because guys can always say, well, I'll have kids later. And they can say that till they're like 80. Whereas women, it's like, no way, man, you got to get it together by the time you're, let's say 40, but really probably by 35, but definitely by 40, because otherwise it ain't happening. And that's bloody dreadful. One of the common routes to extreme unhappiness is to want children and not have them. I wouldn't recommend that. You know, you see couples who are in their 30s. 1 couple in 3 over the age of 30 has fertility problems. That's defined as inability to conceive after 1 year of trying. 1 in 3. It's worth thinking about, because people are very, very unhappy if they want to have kids and then they can't. Man, you're in the medical mill for 10 years if that's what happens to you.
We all have difficult lives, you know, that life is characterized in large part by suffering. That there's an inevitable element of suffering in life. And not only is life sorrowful in part, but it's also touched by malevolence, and malevolence of each of us, and the malevolence of our social creations, our societies, and even in some sense the kind of blind malevolence of nature. And so it's a demanding occupation to exist as a human being, and you need something to sustain yourself through that. It's not optional, because the price of existence is so high that without that sustaining meaning, it corrupts you, it embitters you, and once you're embittered, things go downhill rapidly. You get vengeful and you get angry and you get destructive, and there's really no limit to that. And I've been suggesting to people that the sustaining meaning that they can find in their life isn't to be found through happiness, let's say, because happiness doesn't work when you're not happy, when things have gone badly for you, for even for accidental reasons. But you can find sustaining meaning in responsibility, and you can take responsibility for yourself. You can do that. And if you take responsibility for yourself, you treat yourself as if you're someone that's worthy of care and discipline. And that has nothing to do with being soft on yourself or the pursuit of pleasure, any of those things. You can take responsibility for yourself, and that works. And then if you do that properly, you can take responsibility for your family. And then if you do that properly, you can take responsibility for your community, and you can continue to burden yourself voluntarily, let's say, with a greater and greater range of existential challenges. And all that does is make more and more and more of you. And that works as an antidote to the catastrophe of life. And you know, so I speak to my audiences seriously and pessimistically in some sense about part of the substructure of existence, the mortal side, the fragile side. But there's more to you than there is to what faces you. And I believe that to be true. And then I'm encouraging people to attempt that. And I think part of the reason that the book has been perhaps particularly popular among men is because I don't think we do a very good job at the moment of encouraging men. We have this idea that there's something intrinsically oppressive about the patriarchy and about masculinity in general. And I think that's nonsense. I think that strong, honest, truthful, courageous men pursuing noble goals is of great benefit to everyone, male and female alike. I've always looked at things, I think, in some ways from the opposite perspective of most, and maybe even most psychologists. It's never been a mystery to me why people are depressed. It's never been a mystery to me why people are anxious and unsettled. It seems obvious why they're concerned and hurt and anxious and unsettled. I think the mystery is how it is that we can conduct ourselves so that that can remain under control. I mean, people deal with very heavy burdens in their life. You know, you don't have to talk to someone for very long. Someone you might be thinking is doing quite well in the world, and sometimes people are. But you don't have to scratch very deep beneath the surface before you find out that they have a family member who has a serious illness, or someone who's suffering through an economic crisis of one form or another, or who there's some source of genuine tragedy 1 degree removed from them, if it's even removed. And most people, even as individuals, have at least one serious problem that they're dealing with. And so it's no mystery that people find it difficult to orient themselves in the world. And the mystery is, well, what can you do about it? And we do know what you can do about it. What you help people do is to identify their problems. That's the first thing, is to confront what's there, the reality of what's there, as bluntly as possible. And so you often end up as a psychotherapist talking to people about their array of problems. It's as if they're putting their cards on the table. And you sort out their problems. It's like, and no, they often decide that many of the things that are bothering them are not really that important. They can wait, but that there are crucial life challenges that present themselves to them. And they're not just psychological problems, although sometimes they are. They're problems in life, right? Existential problems. And then what you do is you help people break them down into manageable units, let's say, strategically, and confront them voluntarily. You know, and there's an echo of that idea. There's an echo of that in Christian thinking, and the echo for that is to pick up your cross voluntarily, which is that you have an unavoidable mortal burden to bear in life. There's no escape from it, except to directly confront it and to take it on voluntarily. And what's so fascinating about that, 2 things. One is that psychotherapists of every stripe understand that this is one of the primary reasons that psychotherapy works. There's no dispute about that among all the different psychotherapeutic schools, is that the confrontation of existential problems, voluntary confrontation, is curative. And that's really something. And so, and the practical aspect of that is quite straightforward. It also indicates, practical and philosophical, it also indicates to you that there's far more to you than you think. Because it turns out that you have substantial problems, genuine, deep problems of malevolence and suffering. But that if you decide that you will take that on as your responsibility, that you can put yourself together psychologically, just the courage, and you can actually solve the problems. And that seems to be true. It's not a naive wish. It seems to be well within our capacity. And I mean, that's part of the message, I would say, of 12 Rules for Life, is that dark as things are, there's more light in you than you know what to do with, and there's more light in you than you can possibly manifest. And the way to find that out is to challenge yourself against these massive problems, and to find out that you're the one that can deal with them. There's probably something that I'm doing wrong or not doing well enough, that I'm being blind to, that I could fix and that I would fix. You know, you need both of those, right? Because there's lots of things about your life that you know aren't right. that you could fix, but you won't. Who knows why? You don't have the discipline or the vision or the courage or the integrity of character or the maturity, or God only knows the reasons. But there are some things that you're doing wrong or not doing that you could fix, that you would fix if you actually want to know something and you actually want to devote yourself to something. If you're willing to make the proper sacrifices, right, and reorient yourself, that you can move towards what you're aiming at. And I can tell you that if you ask yourself in all humility how it is that you could be better and what you could do in a small way to move in that direction, that first of all, you will receive an answer about what you're doing wrong. It's not that much different than thinking. We don't regard that as particularly miraculous. Like, you could ask yourself a question and come up with an answer. But if you ask yourself a question about how it is that you're lesser than you could be and what you could do about that, you'll find out. And then if you do that, then you won't be lesser. And that works. And it especially works. It's a nice form of humility as well, because what you're going to find out if you ask that question is it's not going to be something you're proud of. It's going to be some little rotten element of your character that you're ashamed of in 15 different ways, and for good reason. And and even the attempt to triumph over it isn't going to be something that you're going to be able to trumpet proudly to your friends and your family, because, you know, to fight off something that's shameful is a private affair in some sense, but you can do it. And if you can improve your life incrementally in that manner, if you have the humility. One of the things Carl Jung, the famous psychoanalyst, said about modern people, which I loved, was that modern people can't see God because they won't look low enough. And a lot of that lowness is internal. It's like, well, what's not good enough about me? And the other thing that's so lovely about that is you're not going to do anyone any harm. You know, if you find out something that you're lacking, if you discover something you're lacking, well, first of all, great, you've discovered something you're lacking, and you need that thing you're lacking because life is difficult. It's going to call everything that there is out of you. And so you need that thing that you're lacking, and then you can work on it incrementally and humbly, you know, humbly meaning you can work on it in the way that someone as flawed as you could work on it successfully. And then it works. And then things get better. And as they get better, they tend to get better and better. And so that's very practical and very much in keeping with psychotherapeutic practice and wisdom. And I would say with ancient wisdom in general. My fervent hope, and perhaps this is something that could be transformed into a prayer, is that the mistakes that I am inevitably going to make while I'm pursuing, that I don't pay an undue price for the mistakes that I'm inevitably going to make as I pursue what I'm pursuing. That's my fervent hope, you know, and it has been since all of this has broken around me, that I would be careful enough in my speech so that I would stay on the right track, on the straight and narrow path, and fulfill whatever obligations are my privilege to fulfill. And what I hope from the people that are supporting me is that if they wish to pray for me, is that I'm careful enough, I remain careful enough and fortunate enough so that my inevitable faults don't interfere too catastrophically with whatever good I might be able to do.